بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. Welcome everyone, ahlan bikum. So nice to see everybody on this Wednesday evening. Also very wonderful to have and honored Dr. Edward Moad, who I know is Omar Yunus as well. We have a relationship that he'll explain inshallah soon. But so we're here to talk about this idea of philosophy, and in particular Islamic philosophy. And it's had a very interesting reception, or I should say interpretation, by many people in Europe and in the English-speaking world. You know, in March 29th, in 1884 in Sorbonne in Paris, the famous professor, Orientalist, Ernest Renan, he made some very interesting comments about the nature of Islam as a religion, and in particular its impact on science and philosophy. And his general understanding of Islam was that it was against scientific inquiry. And he in particularly identified of the individuals that he had in mind was Imam al-Ghazali radiallahu anhu, and as the enemy of philosophy. And and then that Islam was against a scientific spirit or a scientific inquiry. And this is all an attempt to understand the nature of the Muslim world and its decline, which has been a topic of conversation amongst Muslims, but interestingly also amongst non-Muslims. They're trying to understand the nature of this decline. And that's a broader context of Renan's comments and observations. And to such an extent that Renan was he looked very favorably to Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and to such an extent that he considered him to be the last exponent of philosophy in the Islamic world. It's quite a long time ago, 1198, to be the last exponent of philosophy. And in his understanding, nothing really took place after that. He states when he died in 1198, Arab philosophy had lost its last representative, and the triumph of the Quran over free thinking was assured for at least 600 years. It is a lot to unpack in this statement, how he understands the Quran, how he understands the nature of free thought, and the nature of philosophy. That won't be our topic tonight, but this is the backdrop against this conversation that we're having, tonight, and Dr. Moad's work as well. But this is not the entire context in which his work is being looked at now. And there has been a lot of interest now in Islamic philosophy, and this narrative has been challenged seriously to be pretty much considered, I would say, dubious at this point. Philosophic thought continued way after Ibn Rushd. He was definitely a stage in Islamic philosophical thought, a very important stage, very impactful one. Imam Ghazali himself was one of those individuals, and there's many other individuals after them in Persia, in India, and in the Muslim world, in places like North Africa as well. And Islamic thought has continued all the way to the 18th century, 19th century, and hopefully with this conversation is continuing with Dr. Edward's book. This will be, there's a lot of interest in Islamic philosophical thought, and I think CMC is also sensing that with the students and in a lot of the questions and what they are seeking to study as well. In particular, though, the tahafut, when we come to the tahafut, the al-falasifa of Imam al-Ghazali, the incoherence of the philosophers, many also had the understanding that Imam Ghazali wrote a work on tahafut al-falasifa, and then Ibn Rushd wrote a response to this work, and pretty much the conversation ended with that. However, when a lot of new research is coming up to kind of change this understanding as well, and some of the work has been looked into is what is the role of the Ottoman scholars and Ottoman scholarship and what role did the tahafut, both works, Imam Ghazali's and Ibn Rushd, play in the Ottoman world. And in the 15th century, we see the Sultan Mehmed II, he actually sponsored two scholars, Khojazada and Alauddin al-Tusi, to write works and commentaries and sort of arbitrate on this debate between Imam Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. And it so happens that Khojazada's work was appreciated, and he won a monetary prize for the work. But Alauddin Tusi's work also was appreciated, and he won a prize, a monetary prize. But Khojazada, in addition to the monetary prize, he got the Sultan's robe as well, because they seem to favor his over this. But that was in the 15th century. Was that also where it ended? And it turns out that that's not the case. This conversation continued, right, much later. And two great scholars in the Ottoman tradition, such as Ibn Kamal Pasha, has written marginal commentaries on these works as well, all the way up to 1736, where one of the Ottoman scholars, al-Skudari, wrote Talkhis al-Tahafut. So that's in the 18th century, this whole, just on the Tahafut itself, it's created numerous commentaries, marginal commentaries, hawashi, on this tradition, to the extent that there's at least identified 10 works total on this tradition, on the Tahafut al-Falasifa tradition. And there's definitely much room for disagreement, we're seeing here. Right? It's not like one side, one or the other. They're looking at the quality of arguments. They're looking at many things, when they're analyzing these works. And so, this is, now we're here tonight, to speak about Dr. Edward's book, The Coherence of the Incoherence, of Imam Ghazali's work here. And I think we should start with, a question about philosophy and falsafa, which he's talked about in the introduction of his work, because we're using the term Islamic philosophy, but yet in Arabic we have the term falsafa. And that's usually looked at pretty negatively. And to be, but to falsaf, when you're talking gibberish, they say you're just talking philosophy, right? These were to falsaf. So that's colloquial, of course, But are these terms, is there a one-to-one relationship between these terms, or is there not? That's something that it's a very important question. I think we should probably first get clarified, and then we can get into the nature. And it's actually a part of his book, so it's not something in addition to his work. And I was very appreciative of his work that he tackled this first in his introduction. So, Dr. Edward, what about the terms philosophy and falsafa? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, in the book I discussed this, and I used the terms differently. Sometimes I use the term philosopher, and sometimes I use the term falsafa or philosopher. And it's because the term philosopher has, well, let's start with philosophy, right? Philosophy means love of wisdom, right? And philosophy really refers to a method, right? A method of pursuing the truth, maybe one might say without any unexamined assumptions, or, the definitions of philosophy are varied, and it's really difficult. If you look at any kind of textbook on philosophy, the chapter where it defines philosophy, in the end, any definition that you give for philosophy would have some objections, and you just have to sort of dive into it and see for yourself what it is, and that's what, But we can say that it's a method and it's sort of a discipline or an inquiry or a pursuit, right? Without any, or purportedly, or like it aspires to pursue its inquiry without any conventional or artificial limitations, right? No sort of, nothing can be like beyond question, and is the idea, right? Whether it's in practice always the case is another question, right? Philosophers who claim to not have any unexamined assumptions often do, right? But philosophy is the pursuit that in which those do become examined or are expected to be examined when it's shown that they're there and they haven't been examined. Yeah. Falsafa, on the other hand, became associated with the particular school of thought or a a related group of schools of thought on the basis of their having been inspired by or highly influenced by Greek thought or Plato and Aristotle, right? And so when we talk about falsafa in classical Islamic tradition, it actually refers to that, a specific sort of doctrine or set of doctrines, rather than a pursuit, right? As a result, and if we use the term philosophy and falsafa, and we conflate the two, what happens is that we get this sort of very Orientalist perspective where we say that a Muslim can only be really philosophical if they agree with Aristotle, whereas a modern Westerner can be philosophical even if he's like Kierkegaard and denies that, or Nietzsche, right, and denies that there's any truth or knowledge or anything like this. And you're like, wow, right? Somebody who's an anti-philosopher in the Western modern tradition can be considered a philosopher, yeah? But to be a philosopher as a Muslim, you have to basically be an Aristotelian, which is, I think, a very limiting and Orientalist sort of position to take. So it's important for us to expand it. I'm not the first one to have this thought. Peter Adamson, if you're familiar with Peter Adamson, his work on Islamic philosophy has a very short introduction to philosophy in the Islamic world, it's called, makes the same point, right? And some of the people who are like looking at Islamic philosophy are starting to include schools of kalam, even usul al-fiqh, and tasawwuf, into the scope of what can be considered Islamic philosophy, in as much as within these disciplines people have posed questions that are and have pursued inquiries that are genuinely philosophical. Yeah. So I use the terms differently in the book. Sometimes when I want to talk about falsafa, I use the term philosopher. And when for example, I make the claim that the debate of the Tahafut is genuinely philosophical pursuit. It's a genuinely philosophical discussion. It's not a kind of polemic by an anti-rationalist or, sort of religious, zealot or fundamentalist against the use of reason, right? And the defense of reason by Ibn Rushd. So it's construed that way, right? And it's construed that way by many parties for their own interests and agendas. So you have a faction which paints Ibn Rushd as a sort of, kind of proto-modernist, rationalist hero of Islam, right? Who tried to save philosophy and reason from al-Ghazali, who was the religious fundamentalist and anti-philosophical, anti-science. Yeah. And you also have the other group who said, well, Ghazali destroyed philosophy and the thread of philosophy, and they basically agree, but then they, they agree that, Ghazali's the one who was the hero, right? And you have another crew, because there's three sides in this debate, really. There's Ibn Sina, al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd, right? Al-Ghazali in the Tahafut al-Philosopher, he specifically brings objections to 20 positions and the arguments that are given for 20 positions to show that the arguments that the philosopher have given for those positions are not demonstratively certain. They don't bring demonstrative certainty as is claimed. Most of those arguments are Ibn Sina's. So we have Ghazali giving his critique of Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd giving his critique. Actually, it seems like about half the time he's critiquing Ibn Sina, right? And then his issue with Ghazali is oftentimes just the problem is that you're presenting Ibn Sina's as arguments as the philosopher arguments, and Ibn Sina was mistaken because he diverted from Aristotle. He didn't understand, right? And Ibn Rushd is defending the pure Aristotelian, what he thinks of as the pure Aristotelian philosophical view, right? And so often Ibn Rushd is as critical of Ibn Sina as he is of Ghazali. And sometimes he agrees with Ghazali. This is how complex and interesting the debate is, and much more than this oversimplified polemic, right? But I bring Ibn Sina in because the other agenda that exists today is also a group of people who seem to think Ibn Sina had completely figured everything out. And, a group of other philosophers who are in a kind of a tradition from Ibn Sina, following Ibn Sina, are like, have achieved a kind of certainty. So, I feel like the debate is approached by people nowadays among Muslims and non-Muslims in a very impoverished way, since everybody uses the two works and the event in Islamic intellectual history for what I think are basically kind of polemic and ideological purposes, rather than the true spirit of the debate, which I would want to say in my book is, like I said, a really genuine philosophical inquiry, where we have people interacting with each other and engaged in a dialectic, but which is a productive dialectic. So that's the conclusion that I'm, bring in the book. I can say that I didn't start out in this project with that. The reason I started out in this project was because, well, I can tell you, I became Muslim after I got a bachelor's degree in philosophy, right? And then I went to graduate school, and that's when I met Omar Qureshi, right? So I was already engaged in philosophy when I became Muslim, and I sort of went from being a sort of atheist or some kind of existentialist or something to becoming Muslim, and didn't really have any path in front of me other than to continue my education in philosophy in graduate school. And I didn't get a chance to really have a sort of formal, traditional Islamic education, right? I kind of pursued in my own reading, yeah? And well, the people that I knew, and Omar was one of the first people who I learned from a lot of important things. Actually, it's really special that I'm with him here today, because I haven't seen him in a long time, and he did play a really important role in my development, actually, and this book actually coming out really in the early time. But I stumbled on a translation of the from Ghazali's famous 17th discussion in the Incoherence of the Philosophers, where it talks about causality and miracles, right? And that sort of latched me into al-Ghazali. So I got a copy of the translation that Michael Marmara had recently published at that time, and started reading it. And I tried to write a few papers, and I tried to write my dissertation on the 17th discussion and the metaphysics of causality. But that thing was really a train wreck, because I have mainly a background, I had at the time, mainly a background in modern Western philosophy, right? When you go to study philosophy, they usually focus on like modern Western philosophy, starting with Descartes. And when they talk about ancient Greek philosophy, and definitely medieval philosophy, they always got to teach you about Plato and Aristotle, but it's a little bit of an oversimplified version, typically, in order to sort of set up maybe a little bit of the straw man to show you how far we've come in modern philosophy. So, when I'm reading the Tahafut al-Philosopher, I'm not really fully understanding it, because I'm looking at it from the perspective of David Hume, for example. Everybody says, Ghazali said, we don't really observe any causal connections between things, so it's not a necessary connection. And it seems like a very sort of radical empirical argument like David Hume would make. And so you read it through that focus, through that lens, right? But then when I went to read the rest of it, I felt like I'm not understanding what's happening, so I have to go back and really in the process, long process. It's been like 20 years, right? Almost. And I have to kind of relearn Aristotle, really, and Plato on their own terms, right? So that I could see what what it would like, so I could understand Ibn Sina's argument that Ghazali is responding to, and I can understand Ghazali's response. Yeah. And then I became really interested in this, and I saw the intricacy of Ghazali's response to Ibn Sina's. And it was interesting, because you read, and if you read, for example, you open up and you start reading Ibn Sina's argument why it's impossible that the world had a beginning, right? And it's pretty convincing. And you're like, wow, man, the guy, how do I get around that? You know what I mean? How can he get around that? The absurdity that he's showing is contained in the proposition that the world had a beginning, right? But then you read on Ghazali's response and like, wow, oh, yeah, it's pretty good too. It's pretty sophisticated. And what motivated me to write the book was then later, and I was in Singapore by that time, and I was into Malaysia, Indonesia, and meeting some other Islamic scholars and philosophers, and I noticed that they actually always give a very simple, oversimpler, like as if they hadn't read Ghazali's critique. They didn't really read the Tahafut al-Philosopher, but they had a response or a criticism of Ghazali, which was the same one that he himself will have relayed in the process in his book, and then responded to. Yeah, so right, and I felt that meant that people weren't really, they weren't sort of representing him accurately enough, fairly enough. So I was motivated to prove that he was a lot smarter than they all thought. You know what I mean? And so what I needed to do was, first of all, I need to look at Ibn Sina's argument, because first I have to show that Ghazali did understand Ibn Sina's argument in each case and did represent it accurately. You see what I mean? Because the first thing that the other side's going to say is he didn't represent he didn't understand it. So you have to show, you have to find Ibn Sina's argument, see if it's the same as what Ghazali represented, right? So that you can evaluate. Otherwise, there's no point in evaluating Ghazali's objection if it's not actually Ibn Sina's argument, right? And then look at what Ibn Rushd had to say, right? And evaluate that, right? So I started out thinking, well, I think that I'm going to defend Ghazali. He's the one who's right, right? And I ended up actually feeling like it's not really that simple. But Rushd had some very good points as well, yeah? Which makes the debate even more rich and valuable, I think, yeah? And so that gave me a different view instead of like trying to like go through and set it out and then show like prove that see Ghazali won, right? It turned out to be different, and I thought this is more valuable as an exercise to see the different considerations that each is bringing, and tend to sort of to explore and try to understand the underlying issues, which are the reasons for their difference. Yeah, and then to use that, hopefully, to kind of pursue and enliven a living discussion, a living train of thought. And so I characterize the aim of this book in the introduction as if, so Ghazali in many parts of the Tahafut, he will say, I'm not interested in, affirming the true doctrine or defending the true doctrine here. This is only a matter of critiquing the philosopher and, right, objecting to or refuting their claim to have proved X, Y, and Z things, like that the world is eternal from, no beginning, or that miracles are impossible, something like this. Yeah. And he said, there'll be another book in which I bring out the true doctrine. So there's some question about what that book is. Omar is convinced, I think, that it's the Iqtisad fil I'tiqad. And it could be, right? Very well could be. And then other people say it's something else, What I did here is I said, I'm going to just sort of bracket that. I'm going to assume he didn't write such a book, but what we're going to do is look at the state of the argument as it is in the Tahafut and then Ibn Rushd's reply. And then sort of extrapolate what should be in Ghazali's book on that basis, right? If Ghazali did write a book of what I call, the ultimate final truth, yeah? On the basis of the debate that goes on in here and the kinds of considerations that it brings you to, right? Let's think about what he should have written in such a book. So maybe it was the Iqtisad fil I'tiqad that was, in his view, the positive doctrine that should be understood as the final truth, right? But we could, by looking at the argument that, the state of the argument, and even in the argument that's given there, right?
Yeah.
Evaluate for ourselves whether that's what he should have thought. Yeah. So I look at this very far away from any kind of appeal to authority. Yeah. And that's the second thing in the book that I specify in the introduction, at least. I'm not interested in what Ghazali's true view is, because it really doesn't matter, and it seems to me, unless we were, pursuing the whole project on the basis of authority, right? Like, for example, setting up before and to say, whatever Ghazali said is true. Therefore, we have to figure out what he really, really meant so that we know what's really, really true, right? And that's when people get into arguments about, oh, so-and-so on his deathbed, he renounced everything and he agreed with me right before he died, where people argue like this because, it matters, who said it. But as Ghazali says often, over and over again, right? Don't know the truth by the man, right? Know the man by the truth. Yeah? And so I'm taking it in that spirit as well.
So thank you for that. So for Imam Ghazali, when he says falasifa, he has a particular school in mind, which is al-Kindi, al-Farabi, Avicenna, and it's not philosophy as we in the West would say, what we mean by that.
Yeah.
And that's an important clarification. What would you say then is this, how would you describe the structure of the tahafut, like just briefly, and then we can get into the introductions too that you spent time on, but how is the tahafut structured? How did Ghazali structure it?
Yeah, so that's interesting. How he did structure it was like I said, he took up refuting the philosopher, right? Excuse me. And then there's a little complication there too, because in his introduction he says that his problem is with what I called in the introduction philosophical posers. People who people hear the names of these philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and high-sounding names, and then they hear that, these guys have discovered the truth, through their special methods, and then they think that puts them to follow those guys, puts them above the rest of the Muslims, and that they don't have to consider themselves the same as everyone else, and maybe they don't have to do their Islamic obligations like prayer and stuff like that, right? And he says that these people overestimate the philosophers because they think that they have achieved certainty in metaphysics, right? And then he goes, I'm going to show them that despite what they think, none of the actual well-known, well-respected philosophers deny God or the Day of Judgment, right? And you're like, well, okay. So he's not really against the philosophy, he's against these philosopher posers, right? So who are the real philosophers then, and who don't deny God and the Day of Judgment? And then who are the philosopher posers? Yeah. But then in the conclusion, there's a kind of a contradiction, because in the conclusion he says, so about these, these doctrines, the philosopher, what's your verdict? Are they kafirs or what? Right? And he says, well, that's not really what I was writing this book about. That's not the main aim, but, it sounds like that to me when I read it. But since he asked, and I have to answer, right, then, these three doctrines constitute kafir, which was belief that God doesn't know particulars, the belief that the world is eternal, and denial of the bodily resurrection. I believe those are the three. Yeah. So there seems like kind of a contradiction between what he says in the introduction and the conclusion, and I don't really know how to resolve that, But he structures the book after that introduction. He really clearly lays out what he's doing, and Ibn Rushd totally ignores the introduction in his response. So I don't know if Ibn Rushd didn't read the introduction, or if he just ignored it. It seems like he didn't read it, because a lot of the ways that he approaches his reputation or his response to Ghazali, it seems like he has failed to know what Ghazali's trying to do. Read the introduction. But he starts out with the 20 issues that he is disputing, and he divides them between the metaphysical issues and the issues that have to do with the natural sciences. Yeah. The metaphysical issues include well, what we would call now cosmology. So it starts out with the issue about whether the cosmos is pre-eternal or had a beginning, right? And that's the largest section in there. And then he goes on to talk about issues about the philosopher. He says, claim that, you know, that God is the agent of the cosmos, but they're not honest when they say that. So we have some discussion about the nature of agency and so forth. And then there's some things about that have to do with the divine attributes and the divine and God's unity. And then issues about God's knowledge, and then about the nature of the soul. There were 20 issues, but I have found that in the midst of trying to write this book, it ended up getting too long. It passed the word limit, and I wasn't finished. And I thought I got to divide it into two. And I found when I needed to divide it into two that there are basically four main areas that these 20 issues cover. That is the cosmos, right? When we talk about things like whether the universe had a beginning or not. And then nature, yeah, the relation between nature and God's action, yeah. And then God himself, right? And the divine attributes and divine unity, and the soul. Now, it turns out to be that the underlying philosophical issues that the question about God's unity and attributes and knowledge and the soul sort of rest on are similar. There's this perennial philosophical problem about the one and the many, right? And it comes in both cases. In the case of nature and the cosmos, we are introduced to questions about the nature of time, the nature of possibility, right? Causation, right? And some other things. And those are the underlying philosophical issues that are under there. So they're connected. And so I was able to take off the half and say, okay, we have, you know, on nature and the cosmos. So basically all the related issues are in one piece. And the next volume hopefully will cover those issues that pertain to God and the soul. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. So in terms of introductions, yeah, you mentioned how important they are. How does Ghazali describe his methodology in this in the Tahafut? Because we spoke about, you know, you mentioned briefly that he's not he doesn't have a positive doctrine in this work, and his goal is something else in this work, in the Tahafut. So, yeah, could you elaborate on that, his methodology, and because that's important for how to read Imam Ghazali's work, and then in terms of what do we find Ghazali's opinion in this work? Is that why we read it, or can't? Sometimes does he have his opinion? What's his whole methodology that he adopts in this work?
Okay. Yeah, so we can to talk about Ghazali's methodology gives us a chance to discuss what the philosopher would have given as the definition of philosophy, you know, what we were just talking about before. And they distinguish between dialectic, well, they had three levels: rhetoric, dialectic, and demonstration, right? Rhetoric is a mode of communication whereby I persuade an audience by moving their emotions, you know what I mean? And I get them to agree to a conclusion in that way, right? Dialectic is where I make an argument for a conclusion, yeah? But the premises of the argument are based on premises that both I and the interlocutor or the audience accept, right? And so I can give the argument, I can say, here's my proof, you know, here's the conclusion. The conclusion is true because of premise A and B, right? They lead to the conclusion. But if it's asked, well, you know, how do we know that premise A and B is true? At some point, we are just going to be saying, well, we all agree that A and B is true. And since we've all agreed that A and B is true, if you and I both agree that A is true, and I can show you that A leads to X, then you have to agree with X, right? We don't question whether A and B are true. It's just on the basis of the fact that we share it, yeah? So the philosopher claim, well, let's say, put it this way, Aristotle, when you look at Aristotle, he kind of lays out this model of knowledge. Demonstrative knowledge would be a kind of knowledge where the argument doesn't go back down to just premises that we all agree to, but they go down to self-evidently true premises. Premises which they don't admit of any further proof, and they don't need any further proof because simply by thinking of them, you know that they're true, right? It's like necessary knowledge in the Kalam. It's basically functioning in the same way, right? But maybe it's a little bit more narrow what they can consider as necessary knowledge. Yeah. Like stuff like the same thing can't be both true and false in the same way at the same time, right? Or the whole is greater than the part, right? And the Munkadh min al-Dalal, al-Ghazali says, oh, you know 10 is more than 3, right? And you know that's so clear that you know you can't be wrong. And even if somebody comes and throws a stick down and it turns into a snake and says, look what I can do, so 3 is more than 10, right? You'll say, no, that's pretty amazing. How'd you do that? But I still know 10 is more than 3. Yeah? This is the high level of, self-evidence, right? So, as an aim or an aspiration of knowledge, right, for it to be resting on such sort of self-evident premises, right, and to aim for, this is the kind of philosopher aim, right? Now, did they actually achieve that? Aristotle and I think probably Al-Farabi, most philosophers maybe would not have claimed to achieve that, but Ibn Sina, it seems like, was a little bit confident, you know what I mean, in his claims to have, right, these self-evident proof, this sort of demonstrative certainty proof. So Ghazali, apparently, he does think that this is a method, right? I mean, logic and demonstrative proof is the strongest kind of proof you can have, right? And he does seem to give the philosopher more credit than the mutakallimin, right? He thinks Kalam is not quite as rigorous in its methods, or hasn't been, right, until incorporating Aristotelian logic into it, right? Which involves a lot. You have to have a valid argument for him. You have to have a clear and precise definition for all the terms and all your premises. You have to check all your bases to make sure there's no wiggle room or no fuzziness, And so it's really the aim to try to have this foolproof kind of proof. So Ghazali basically says in there, I'm going to use your own logic, right? And the standards that you actually apply and claim to pass. And I'm going to look at the arguments that you give for these 20 things. And I'm going to apply your own standards and show that you fail to meet the standards of demonstrative certainty that you yourself, claim to meet and apply. And he does so, right? And he does so quite effectively. So, that's his method. Part of what we think of the method could be the parameters, right? And I distinguish between method and parameters. What is he actually going to do? And that's exactly one of the parameters. He's not actually arguing for any positive doctrine of his own. He's just showing that the philosopher failed to prove these 20 things. And he is limiting himself, he says, to those issues which really do pertain to fundamental principles of religion, right? And he wants to avoid merely semantic disputes, right? So, for example, he talks about the term substance, right? They say God is a substance, Asherites will say, no, God's not a substance, because God's not a body, because by substance, one side means body, but the philosopher, they just mean, right, a self-subsisting existent. It doesn't, whose existence doesn't need or subsist in anything else. And so once we are clear on the terms, we don't have to debate about the term, right? And he also believes that whenever something is demonstratively proven and appears to contradict something that is specified in Revelation, right, like a hadith or in the Quran, then we should figuratively interpret the content of the hadith or Quran rather than to deny what is demonstratively proven, right? But again, that's a high standard of demonstrative proof. I mean, it's like mathematical proof, right? That's not like the theory of evolution, right? Which is not proven with nearly the kind of demonstrative certainty that, he would be requiring. The example he gives is the eclipse, right? He says the eclipse is the interposition between the moon and the right and the sun. And so that's, demonstratively proven. And if somebody were to say no, because this hadith says that the sun goes down under the earth and makes sujood to Allah, right? Then, well, he says, well, person who's going to deny the proof about what the eclipse is on the basis of that is the worst enemy of religion rather than the friend, and that the one who does that will make Islam look foolish, right? And so he advocates for the idea of figuratively interpreting, right, the text when it comes to conflict with that kind of proven thing. Yeah.
Excellent. So I guess the last question was if you could state what your aim is in this text, in your book, and do you feel, in about 5 minutes, did you achieve your aim and or not?
Well, my aim changed, right? Like I said, I feel like what I wanted to show was that this was a genuinely philosophical exercise that these two men, went through with each other, and that it's a valuable one for us to approach as such, right? So, in each of the 20, well, I didn't cover all the 20 discussions in this part of the book, but there are many places where I think Ghazali made a point. There are places where I think Ibn Rushd made a point. There are places where it's inconclusive, yeah? And that's what I think not to be inconclusive. Being inconclusive is not the goal, right? Because we want to ascertain the truth, you know what I mean? But when you want to ascertain the truth, it means that you don't just want an answer, right? You want the true answer. So you're always going to be open, right, for examining and pursuing it further. So where questions are left open, yeah, it's better that they remain left open. Yeah. And of the two, actually, if I wanted to make some kind of verdict on the two, especially regarding this idea that Ibn Rushd was the sort of defender of science and al-Ghazali was the opponent of science, right? Inasmuch as science requires this sort of tentativeness and this sort of sense that, this particular answer that I'm on right now could be wrong and I should be open to any possibility that I'm mistaken in this regard. It's Ghazali who's more scientific, actually, because he's the one who is exploring, in each case where, we may be wrong about things. And it's Ibn Rushd who has another side of it, right? Because I compare it to the idea that, the heart of the believer should be stretched between fear and hope, right? And that there's this tension between the two. And that if you were just to sort of cave in on one side, you would collapse into despair. Or if you were to cave on the other side, you'd be complacent, right? So I don't think either of them are too extreme, but definitely Ibn Rushd is a defender of a scientific mindset in the sense that he has a strong faith that the universe and the cosmos is created in an orderly way, such that it would conform to the ability of the human being to ascertain and to understand and to comprehend, right? If we use our faculties correctly in pursuing that knowledge. And he believes that what makes the intellect realized, right? He says what realizes the intellect and makes it intellect is in fact that comprehension of the reality of things, right? Yeah. So is this a thing that is taken on faith? It seems like it, right? I mean, in some sense, this is a position that Ibn Rushd has taken and defends out of faith, right? He believes that God would not create, an obscure and chaotic and, inscrutable universe, And so he's defending the potential and the possibility for human beings to comprehend the universe out of a real reverence for God. And it's not that Ibn Rushd is just faking to be a religious man. If you read him, you would never take that view seriously. You know what I mean? This is, I think, a modern kind of assumption that any smart guy that's religious from before couldn't have been really religious. He must have just been playing to, to paying lip service or something. This is not true. You can tell from what he says. Ghazali, on the other hand, is the one who's always questioning these assumptions, right? Maybe not everything in the universe is something we can understand, yeah? And so he's, in some sense, that's also a necessary feature of a scientific mind. We have two sides here, right? We need to have sort of faith in the comprehensibility of things and our ability to comprehend things enough to keep us looking for answers, right, and pursuing knowledge, right? But we also have to have enough epistemic humility, right, and enough sort of, let's say, awareness of our fallibility and the potential that we may be mistaken, right? And skepticism, you might say, yeah? What's the methodological skepticism, right? In order to check ourselves. And it's funny that Ghazali's the one who exhibits that. Because in modern terms, right, we kind of construe the methodological skeptic as the sort of less religious, right? And the one who is full of faith in the ability of the human mind to comprehend God's order as more, the defender of a faith. I think they're both representing sides of the coin that are necessary, yeah? And so I really, encourage anybody reading these two books, and hopefully if you read my book, right? But if you do read my book, I hope you read these primary sources because they're available. You know what I mean? Otherwise, it's kind of like, who knows? There could be a lot of mistakes in here, I hope there's some mistakes in here because otherwise it'd be boring. And I need to give you guys something to do, right? You got to look through it and find my mistakes so you can write the incoherence of the coherence of the incoherence. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much. There's a lot to think about here. I think one of the things that we can take away is these type of dichotomies that are set up: reason, revelation. What we see with Ibn Rushd is reason, and Ghazali is religion, and they're at war. I mean, it's clearly not the case. Both believed in the same religion, believed in the same God, same prophet, the Quran. They had different understandings of the relationship, nonetheless, but it definitely wasn't something to be, that understanding, if you impose that on her, I think you're missing out on the reality of the whole discussion and the interactions, that engagement that they had with you and what they were trying to do ultimately. Ibn Rushd, as we know, he was a judge, a Maliki Qadi. He wrote some profound works in Islamic law, authoritative works, Bidayat al-Mujtahid. He actually summarized one of Ghazali's books on usul, his Mustasfa. He wrote a whole summary on it, Ad-Daruri fi Ilm al-Usul, and he praised Imam Ghazali's book in al-Mustasfa in legal theory. Both were very practicing Muslims. They took the faith very seriously. Ultimately, for Ibn Rushd, he felt that the philosophic enterprise and the activity of the philosopher, which is an-nadhar fil mawjudat, which is to inquiry and conduct inquiry on existent things, for him, that inquiry should not, what should not come under the scope of that inquiry are religious doctrines, things like miracles, the resurrection. That should be accepted. And the philosopher in Ibn Rushd's understanding shouldn't investigate those things, what he calls a mabadi' ad-din or mabadi' al-shari'ah. Those are things that the philosopher should not conduct an investigation on. They should just accept them. And everything else is something that they can it's the scope of their inquiry. For Imam Ghazali, it seems like, well, we have to have a whole comprehensive account and understanding of everything. And hence miracles, well, let's look at them and let's try to understand miracles in this way. For Ibn Rushd, it was, no, that's outside of the scope of inquiry, of philosophical thought. And so these are two different approaches, one could say, that are here. No doubt, in terms of influence, Imam Ghazali's influence, Ibn Avicenna's influence was quite significant in the Islamic world, and led to a lot further conversations taking place. But nonetheless, this understanding that, this is reason, one represents reason, one represents religion, and it's certainly misleading, and I would say incorrect. Both appreciated reason, both understood logic, Aristotelian logic, and both worked with logic, and they were using logic as a tool for understanding these issues. And so it definitely wasn't that dichotomy, I think, is very misleading. And like I said, just reading the primary works will help in understanding this, and also reading Dr. Edward's work as well. Before we get to question and answer, I do want to say it's a very enjoyable conversation. Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards. Let's give him a round of applause. Yeah.